Some people say destiny is a gift, but in my world, destiny has started more wars than greed ever could. The city of Blackridge never truly slept because every street belonged to someone. Every tower carried the crest of an alpha family, and every promise had a price measured in loyalty instead of money. At the very top stood Damien Ashford, the youngest alpha ever to lead the Ashford Syndicate, a man whose reputation had become larger than the skyline itself. People believed he could read betrayal before it happened, and that was exactly why tonight made no sense. Intelligence had reported that the Whitmore family was preparing to move the heir who controlled their future influence inside the Alpha and Omega Council. Damien had no intention of starting a war. He wanted leverage, one living bargaining piece powerful enough to force peace on his own terms before another generation inherited endless blood feuds. The operation unfolded with disciplined precision as his people secured the Whitmore estate, but something was wrong from the moment Damien crossed the entrance hall. The mansion felt abandoned, not defeated. Portraits still hung on polished walls. Dinner plates remained untouched, and every expensive clock continued ticking as though the family had vanished between seconds. There were no signs of panic, only careful preparation. Whoever planned this wanted someone to arrive too late. Damien ordered his team to search every room while he followed a faint light glowing beneath an old library door. Inside sat a young Omega alone beside a large window overlooking the rain. He wore a simple white shirt beneath a dark sweater, completely out of place among shelves filled with legal records and ancient family documents. The Omega did not run. He did not plead. He simply lifted calm gray eyes toward Damien, as if he had been expecting this exact moment. Damien demanded his name, but silence answered him. One of the Ashford guards quietly discovered a notebook resting beside the chair. The Omega accepted it without hesitation and wrote only 2 words in neat handwriting. Elias Whitmore. Before Damien could ask another question, another guard whispered that the Omega was unable to speak. The realization shifted the atmosphere inside the room. Damien had expected arguments, deception, perhaps even arrogance from the enemy's son. Instead, he found someone whose silence seemed stronger than most voices. Intelligence confirmed the identity within minutes. Elias was indeed the youngest son of Luther Whitmore, although every official record described him as politically insignificant. Damien frowned. Powerful families never abandoned valuable children unless those children carried a secret more dangerous than influence. He ordered Elias escorted safely to the armored convoy. The Omega stood immediately without resistance, carrying only the notebook in his hands. As they walked through the grand hallway, Damien noticed something unexpected. Elias paused beside a damaged family portrait lying against the wall. Instead of looking at his father, he gently straightened the frame so a faded image of his late mother could be seen clearly before continuing toward the exit. It was such a small gesture that none of the soldiers understood its meaning, yet Damien found himself remembering it long after they left the estate behind. The drive across Blackridge lasted nearly 40 miles beneath heavy rain. No one spoke. Elias quietly watched the city lights slide across the window while Damien reviewed confidential files on a secure tablet. Every document described Elias as fragile, sheltered, and politically useless. None of them matched the composed young man sitting across from him. When Damien finally looked up, their eyes met for only a heartbeat, but something impossible happened. A strange warmth settled deep inside Damien's chest, not painful, not overwhelming, simply undeniable, like hearing a familiar melody he had somehow forgotten years ago. He immediately looked away, dismissing it as exhaustion after a long operation. Even so, Damien quietly reminded himself that instinct alone had never guided an Ashford leader. Whatever strange feeling lingered between them, trust would have to be earned through evidence rather than emotion. Until then, Elias remained an unknown guest whose actions, not an unexplained sensation, would determine every decision that followed. Across the vehicle, Elias lowered his eyes and slowly tightened his grip around the notebook, as though he had felt the same impossible connection. Neither of them understood that the invisible thread had already been woven long before either family chose hatred, and before dawn arrived over Blackridge. Destiny had quietly stepped into the middle of a war that neither Alpha nor Omega had ever intended to fight. Elias expected chains, interrogation, and cold isolation, Yet the Ashford estate surprised him in ways that felt almost unsettling. Instead of a prison cell, he was placed inside a quiet guest suite overlooking a courtyard where ancient oak trees swayed in the morning breeze. 2 security officers remained outside the door at all times, but no one entered without permission. Damien had ordered that the Omega be treated as an honored detainee rather than a criminal, a decision that immediately confused his own advisors. Several senior Alpha captains questioned the wisdom of showing respect to the son of their greatest rival, but Damien dismissed every objection with a calm expression he could not fully explain even to himself. The strange feeling from the previous night had never completely disappeared. It lingered quietly beneath every decision, impossible to ignore yet impossible to understand. Elias explored the room with careful eyes until he discovered shelves filled with books on law, history, and the political structure governing Alpha, Beta, and Omega citizens. He gently smiled for the first time since arriving. Hours later, a young servant accidentally dropped a tray in the hallway, sending several documents across the polished floor. Before anyone else reacted, Elias knelt and gathered every page in perfect order without hesitation. The servant thanked him, but Damien, who had been walking past the open doorway, immediately noticed something remarkable. The reports had landed face down, yet Elias returned them already sorted into their original sequence. Curious, Damien deliberately mixed the pages again and placed them on the table. Elias quietly watched for only a few seconds before arranging every sheet exactly as it had been. The servant looked astonished. Damien narrowed his eyes. This was not luck. This Omega possessed an extraordinary visual memory. Later that afternoon, Damien ordered archived intelligence files concerning the Whitmore family. Hidden beneath official biographies was a sealed medical report stating that Elias had demonstrated exceptional pattern recognition as a child. Another confidential note described him as an unsuitable heir because he could not speak publicly before the council despite possessing remarkable analytical abilities. Damien found the wording strangely dismissive. It sounded less like an evaluation and more like an excuse to hide someone valuable. That evening, another unexpected discovery changed everything again. While inspecting a forgotten storage room beneath the Ashford estate, maintenance workers uncovered several crates delivered years earlier during a diplomatic exchange between the 2 families. Inside were research journals confiscated from an abandoned laboratory once funded jointly by influential members of the Alpha and Omega Council. Damien reviewed the material personally. The documents described controversial studies attempting to predict and regulate fated bonds through legal classifications rather than natural compatibility. Several names had been blacked out, but one reference appeared repeatedly beside technical observations. Subject E. Damien carried one journal to Elias and quietly placed it on the table. The Omega turned the pages slowly until his hands stopped trembling. His breathing grew uneven, and after a long silence he wrote only one sentence across a blank page. I live there. Damien felt an unfamiliar weight settle over his thoughts. Elias pointed toward faded sketches showing examination rooms before drawing a simple floor plan from memory. Every hallway, every staircase, every locked archive matched details found elsewhere in the journals. It became painfully clear that Elias had not merely read about the facility. He had survived it. Damien looked at the calm young Omega across the table and realized that the person he had believed to be a bargaining piece had spent years treated as little more than evidence inside someone else's experiment. For the first time since becoming head of the Ashford Syndicate, Damien began to wonder whether the family he considered his greatest enemy had been hiding a far darker secret than any criminal alliance. The discoveries hidden inside the research journals refused to leave Damien's thoughts. Every page revealed another piece of a system carefully built around Alpha and Omega classifications, not to protect society as the council claimed, but to control it. The following morning, he summoned his oldest legal advisor, Margaret Holloway, one of the few betas trusted by every faction because she understood the history behind the modern ABO legal code. Without revealing Elias's identity, Damien presented copies of the recovered documents and asked one simple question. Margaret studied the faded pages for nearly an hour before quietly closing the final journal. She explained that several decades earlier, the council had passed the Harmony Statutes, laws supposedly created to prevent conflicts caused by powerful fated bonds. Hidden inside those regulations was a little-known clause. If an alpha leading one of the recognized syndicate families formed a verified fated bond with an omega belonging to a declared enemy bloodline, that alpha could immediately lose legal authority over inherited territory because the council considered such a bond an unacceptable conflict of loyalty. Damien remained silent, but the meaning landed with unmistakable clarity. If the strange connection he had already begun to feel proved genuine, everything his family had built for generations could disappear with a single ruling. Margaret warned him that the council had enforced the law only a handful of times, yet every recorded case ended with another political faction gaining power. Someone always benefited. After she departed, Damien found Elias standing quietly in the estate library, carefully organizing historical books that had been misplaced years before. The Omega looked up as Damien entered, immediately recognizing from his expression that something important had changed. Damien placed a legal volume on the table and opened it to the section describing bond recognition. Elias read every line with growing concern before slowly writing on his notebook. They feared this. Damien frowned. Elias turned several pages inside one of the recovered journals and pointed toward handwritten notes describing how certain influential leaders had searched for methods to predict, suppress, or even manipulate future bonds between important bloodlines. The objective had never been scientific curiosity. It had been political control. Damien suddenly understood why the Whitmore family had hidden Elias from public life despite his remarkable intelligence. If someone suspected he could one day become part of a politically dangerous bond, keeping him invisible became the safest strategy. That afternoon, Damien ordered every electronic record mentioning Elias transferred into an isolated, encrypted archive accessible only to himself. He also instructed his security chief that no biological testing of the Omega would be permitted without his direct approval. His captains questioned the unusual order, but Damien offered no explanation. Late that evening, he stepped onto a quiet balcony overlooking the estate gardens. Rain clouds had finally cleared, revealing a sky filled with stars. Elias quietly joined him, carrying only his notebook and a warm cup of tea prepared by the kitchen staff. Neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable rather than awkward. After several peaceful minutes, Elias wrote another sentence and turned the notebook toward Damien. Not every law protects people. Some protect fear. Damien read the words twice before looking toward the city lights stretching across the horizon. For years, he had believed the council existed to preserve stability between Alpha, Beta, and Omega communities. Now he began to suspect that stability had been carefully manufactured by people who feared losing their own authority. As the night grew colder, Damien made a decision that would quietly reshape everything that followed. Until he uncovered the complete truth behind the hidden research and the council's secret laws, no one outside the Ashford estate would learn about the extraordinary connection beginning to form between himself and Elias. Even if protecting that secret meant standing against the most powerful institutions in the entire ABO world. The next morning began with a discovery that changed the direction of every question Damien had been asking. While reviewing the recovered laboratory records once again, Elias suddenly stopped turning the pages. His eyes remained fixed on a tiny handwritten symbol hidden inside the corner of an aging document. He immediately reached for his notebook and carefully copied the mark before drawing the same symbol beside an old family crest from memory. Damien recognized neither image, but Elias nodded with complete certainty. The two designs belonged together. Intrigued, Damien authorized access to the Ashford family's private archive, a collection so old that even senior advisors rarely entered it. Hidden beneath the estate library, the underground vault stretched through long stone corridors lined with shelves containing treaties, court rulings, and sealed correspondence dating back more than a century. Elias walked slowly through the maze as though following memories instead of directions. Every few minutes he stopped, studying faded labels before quietly changing course without explanation. Finally, he paused before a forgotten cabinet buried beneath decades of dust. Damien unlocked it himself. Inside rested dozens of leather folders carrying the same unfamiliar symbol Elias had drawn only minutes earlier. The oldest file contained the original Harmony Accord signed after the Great Division between Alpha and Omega territories. Margaret Holloway arrived shortly afterward to help examine the fragile documents. As she carefully compared the original agreement with the version currently enforced throughout the country, her expression slowly changed from curiosity to disbelief. Entire paragraphs had disappeared. Several legal protections guaranteeing independent property rights, educational access, and political representation for Omegas had been removed before the law entered public circulation. More surprising still, the original signatures revealed that the principal author of those protections had not been an Alpha statesman as history claimed. They belonged to Evelyn Whitmore, Elias's late mother. Damien looked toward Elias, who quietly closed his eyes before opening another folder. Inside rested dozens of handwritten notes explaining why balanced cooperation between alphas, betas, and omegas created stronger communities than systems built upon dominance. The philosophy reflected everything Damien had never been taught. Elias carefully touched one page before writing a single sentence. She knew they would erase her. Margaret confirmed that Evelyn had disappeared from public records shortly after presenting her legal reforms, while official history simply credited an anonymous council committee. Someone had deliberately rewritten both the law and the legacy behind it. Damien immediately realized that Victor Hale, now the influential chairman of the council, had inherited authority from the very institution that benefited most from those revisions. The conspiracy extended far beyond one laboratory or one family. It had shaped the foundation of modern ABO society itself. Rather than hiding the discovery, Damien made another unexpected choice. He invited Margaret to remain permanently inside the estate and begin cataloging every surviving original document before they could be altered again. Elias joined the effort without hesitation, reconstructing damaged pages through his extraordinary visual memory whenever missing sections appeared. Day after day, the quiet Omega became less like a protected hostage and more like an indispensable partner in uncovering the truth. Their growing trust changed naturally through shared purpose rather than dramatic declarations. One evening, after hours spent preserving fragile records, Damien placed a fresh journal on the table in front of Elias. Instead of using it to document evidence, he gestured for Elias to keep it as his own. The Omega hesitated before accepting the gift with a grateful smile that required no words. At that simple moment, Damien understood that protecting Elias was no longer merely a strategic decision connected to hidden laws or unexplained destiny. It had become a personal promise built upon respect, while somewhere, beyond the estate walls, the people who had buried Evelyn Whitmore's work were already beginning to realize that someone had started uncovering the truth they had spent decades trying to erase. Within a week, quiet whispers began traveling through every influential Alpha household in Blackridge. Someone inside the Ashford Syndicate had leaked a carefully edited rumor claiming that Damien had become unusually protective of an unidentified Omega connected to the Whitmore family. No names appeared, but the implication spread faster than any official announcement because the Alpha and Omega Council encouraged influential families to report any suspicious bond activity that could threaten political stability. Damien immediately understood that someone close to him had betrayed the estate's secrecy. Instead of reacting publicly, he ordered an internal review while continuing his work inside the archive with Elias and Margaret. Every document they restored strengthened the same conclusion. The existing legal system had not evolved naturally over time. It had been deliberately reshaped to concentrate authority in the hands of a select group led by Victor Hale and his allies. Late one afternoon, Damien convened a private meeting with his senior captains. Some had served the Ashford family for decades, while others had risen through the organization because of exceptional discipline. As the discussion turned toward recent intelligence, one captain insisted that keeping the Whitmore Omega inside the estate had become too dangerous. Another argued that returning Elias would demonstrate loyalty to traditional Alpha leadership and silence the growing rumors. Damien listened without interruption until every opinion had been expressed. Then he calmly stated that no guest under Ashford protection would ever be surrendered to political pressure. The room fell completely silent. Several captains exchanged uncertain glances because Damien had deliberately chosen the word guest instead of hostage. The distinction carried enormous meaning within the customs governing Alpha families. Outside the meeting room, Elias continued organizing Evelyn Whitmore's original legal drafts when a secure communication arrived from an anonymous source. The message contained only a photograph showing the entrance of the abandoned research facility where Elias had once lived. On the back appeared 5 handwritten words. "We know where he is." Damien studied the image carefully before quietly destroying the paper. Whoever sent it possessed information available only to someone connected either to the council or to his own organization. Security throughout the estate increased immediately, yet Damien refused to isolate Elias behind locked doors. Instead, he invited the Omega to accompany him openly through the estate's administrative offices. Employees who expected to see a frightened captive instead witnessed Damien asking Elias for observations while reviewing historical records and financial reports. The change surprised everyone. Elias answered every question through written notes, frequently identifying inconsistencies that experienced accountants had overlooked. His remarkable memory became impossible to dismiss. Respect slowly replaced curiosity among many Ashford staff members, although not everyone welcomed the transformation. That evening, another emergency meeting gathered the heads of several allied Alpha families. They warned Damien that protecting an Omega connected to the Whitmores risked damaging long-standing alliances. One elder even suggested that Alpha authority depended upon appearing emotionally detached when making political decisions. Damien listened politely before responding with unexpected calm. He reminded every leader that strength built upon fear eventually demanded endless sacrifices, while strength built upon justice created loyalty that no threat could purchase. The statement divided the room. Some left unconvinced, while others quietly reconsidered beliefs they had accepted for years. From a nearby balcony, Elias observed the gathering through tall windows. Although he could not hear every word, he clearly saw Damien standing alone after the meeting ended, surrounded by empty chairs once occupied by powerful allies. Without hesitation, Elias walked outside and silently handed Damien the small notebook that had accompanied him since the night they first met. On its final unused page, he had written one simple sentence: "Standing alone for what is right is still standing." Damien closed the notebook with a grateful smile, unaware that Victor Hale had already begun assembling a coalition determined to seize both Elias and every forgotten truth hidden inside Evelyn Whitmore's restored legacy. Elias barely slept after the anonymous warning reached the Ashford estate, because every forgotten memory from the abandoned research facility now seemed connected to the conspiracy surrounding the council. Instead of allowing fear to control his thoughts, he filled pages inside his notebook with sketches, dates, names, and architectural details that had remained hidden inside his remarkable memory for years. By sunrise, his desk had become a map of fragments waiting to become answers. When Damien entered the room carrying breakfast, he found the Omega carefully comparing Evelyn Whitmore's legal drafts with diagrams copied from the laboratory journals. Elias immediately pointed toward several matching symbols that neither Damien nor Margaret had previously noticed. Every symbol appeared beside references to regional council archives rather than scientific records. Margaret studied the evidence before quietly reaching an unexpected conclusion. The laboratory had never existed simply to study unusual bonds. It had also functioned as a repository where politically inconvenient legal evidence could be hidden beneath classified research. Elias quickly wrote another observation. If the missing legal amendments still existed, they were probably never destroyed. They were merely relocated. Damien looked at the carefully arranged documents spread across the table and realized that Elias was no longer following his lead. He was building an investigation entirely on his own. Rather than questioning the Omega's reasoning, Damien did something that surprised everyone present. He pushed aside his own notes, placed a city map in front of Elias, and calmly asked him to decide where they should search next. Margaret smiled quietly because she recognized the significance of that moment. Damien had stopped treating Elias as someone under his protection alone. He now trusted his judgment. Elias studied the map for several minutes before circling an old courthouse that had officially closed nearly 20 years earlier when council operations moved into a modern government complex. According to public records, The building now stored historical tax files. Yet one of Evelyn's handwritten references matched the courthouse's original archive number exactly. Damien immediately assembled a small team composed only of people whose loyalty had never been questioned. By late afternoon, they entered the forgotten building through dusty corridors untouched for decades. Instead of searching randomly, Damien allowed Elias to lead the way. The Omega moved through abandoned offices with quiet confidence, stopping occasionally to compare wall markings with images preserved inside his memory. Finally, he reached an old records room where hundreds of steel filing cabinets stood beneath layers of dust. Most appeared empty until Elias noticed tiny scratches beside one cabinet that had been moved far more recently than the others. Behind it, they discovered a concealed storage chamber containing sealed boxes marked with obsolete council classifications. Inside rested original legislative drafts, correspondence between Victor Hale's predecessors, and financial records documenting years of unauthorized influence over judicial appointments throughout the ABO legal system. Margaret carefully examined several documents before looking toward Damien with unmistakable certainty. The evidence proved that the council had intentionally manipulated inheritance law, bond recognition, and Omega civil protections to maintain political control for generations. As the team quietly photographed every page, Damien turned toward Elias with genuine admiration. Without the Omega's memory, none of this hidden history would have been found. On the drive back to the estate, Damien handed Elias the encrypted drive containing copies of every recovered document. It was the most sensitive information under Ashford control, and by placing it in Elias's hands, Damien demonstrated complete trust. Elias looked at him with visible surprise. Before writing only 4 words, "We finished this together." Damien nodded without hesitation because for the first time since this journey began, neither of them was carrying the burden alone. Somewhere inside the council headquarters, Victor Hale still believed he controlled the game, unaware that the quiet Omega he had once considered insignificant had already uncovered the foundation needed to challenge an entire system built upon hidden lies. The evidence recovered from the abandoned courthouse should have remained hidden for decades, yet Victor Hale moved faster than anyone expected. Before Damien and his team could prepare a legal challenge, every major news network interrupted regular programming with an emergency announcement from the Alpha and Omega Council. Standing before dozens of cameras, Victor declared that reliable intelligence indicated an unlawful fated bond involving the leader of the Ashford Syndicate and an Omega descended from a rival bloodline. Although he never spoke Damien or Elias by name, everyone understood exactly who he meant. Within hours, the story spread across Blackridge. Public debate erupted in every neighborhood, every council office, and every influential family estate. Supporters of the existing system insisted that the Harmony statutes required immediate action to prevent divided loyalties. Others quietly questioned why the council had learned about such private information before any formal investigation had even begun. Damien watched the broadcast from the estate library without changing his expression, but the consequences arrived almost immediately. Several long-standing allies suspended their agreements with the Ashford family. Financial institutions delayed transactions connected to syndicate properties pending council review. Invitations to political meetings disappeared overnight. By sunset, Damien remained the legal head of his organization in name. Yet much of the authority he had relied upon for years had already begun slipping away. Margaret Holloway placed updated reports across the conference table and explained that Victor had carefully exploited the very laws they had been investigating. The accusations alone were enough to isolate Damien before any hearing could take place. Across the room, Elias quietly read every document before lowering his notebook. His eyes no longer reflected uncertainty. They carried determination. He understood that remaining hidden would only strengthen Victor's narrative. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at the estate under a flag of diplomatic protection. It was Luther Whitmore. For the first time since Elias had been taken from the Whitmore mansion, father and son stood only a few feet apart. Luther barely acknowledged Elias before addressing Damien directly. He claimed that returning the Omega would allow both families to avoid further political consequences. Damien calmly refused. Only then did Luther finally look toward his son, but there was no warmth in his expression, only calculation. Elias slowly opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence before turning it toward his father. "You never came to save me before." Luther read the words without replying. After a long silence, he simply turned and walked away, confirming every painful suspicion Elias had carried for years. Once the gates closed behind the departing convoy, Damien stepped beside Elias without speaking. No promises were necessary because their trust had already been built through countless quiet decisions rather than dramatic speeches. Later that night, Elias requested access to every recovered document, every restored treaty, every financial record, and every journal connected to Evelyn Whitmore's work. Margaret and Damien watched as he carefully organized the evidence into a chronological sequence that revealed not isolated acts of corruption, but an entire system designed to reshape society generation after generation. Instead of defending themselves against Victor's accusations, Elias proposed something far bolder. They would present the complete truth to the public before the council could manipulate another hearing behind closed doors. Damien studied the carefully arranged files spread across the table and realized that the reserved Omega, who had once entered the estate carrying only a small notebook, was now leading the most important decision of their shared journey. Without hesitation, Damien placed his hand over the stack of evidence and nodded. Whatever happened next, they would face the consequences together, not as a syndicate leader protecting a hostage, but as two people united by trust, determined to challenge a system that had depended upon silence for far too long. By sunrise the following day, every piece of evidence Elias had organized was prepared for public release. Instead of sending isolated documents to friendly officials, Damien accepted Elias's strategy completely. They would reveal the entire historical record at once so that no single page could be dismissed as fabrication or taken out of context. Margaret arranged an emergency petition requiring the Alpha and Omega Council to convene a public session under transparency provisions that had quietly remained in the original legal charter, although those clauses had almost never been invoked. Victor Hale accepted the hearing with complete confidence, believing he still controlled both the narrative and the institution. The Grand Council chamber filled with representatives from influential Alpha families, Omega advocacy groups, Beta legal organizations, journalists, and citizens who had never before been allowed to witness deliberations of such importance. Damien entered without the political entourage he once commanded. Many former allies refused even to meet his eyes. Elias walked beside him carrying only the familiar notebook and the encrypted archive containing years of hidden history. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the tension filling the chamber. Victor opened the proceedings by repeating that unauthorized bonds between hostile bloodlines endangered public stability and justified immediate intervention. Before he could continue, Margaret requested permission to introduce historical evidence preserved under the original Harmony Accord. The request could not legally be denied. One document after another appeared on the large public displays surrounding the chamber. Original signatures, restored legal drafts, financial ledgers, internal correspondence. Each record connected seamlessly with the next, revealing how Omega civil protections had been systematically removed, how inheritance laws had been rewritten to strengthen council influence, and how generations of judicial appointments had been quietly manipulated to preserve that structure. The audience grew noticeably quieter with every page. Then Margaret presented the original manuscript written by Evelyn Whitmore. For the first time in decades, the public saw her name attached to the legal framework that history had attributed to anonymous officials. Elias stepped forward and opened his notebook. Although he could not speak, the council's accessibility rules required that his written testimony be displayed exactly as submitted. His words appeared across the chamber's large screens. "I was taught that silence would keep powerful people comfortable. Today's silence would only protect a lie." He then revealed the reconstructed diagrams from the abandoned research facility, demonstrating that classified laboratories had been used to conceal legal archives and suppress evidence rather than pursue legitimate public research. Experts invited to review the records confirmed that the documents were authentic and internally consistent. Victor attempted to challenge isolated details, but every objection was answered by another authenticated record recovered from a different archive. The pattern became impossible to deny. Even several council members who had previously supported Victor began distancing themselves from his leadership. Attention then turned toward Luther Whitmore. Financial transfers and private correspondence proved that he had willingly cooperated with the council for years, allowing Elias's isolation to continue because preserving political influence mattered more than protecting his own son. Faced with overwhelming documentation, Luther offered no meaningful defense. The chamber fell into heavy silence before the presiding judicial committee announced that Victor Hale and his closest associates would immediately lose administrative authority pending independent legal review, while every disputed statute would undergo emergency reconsideration using the original Harmony Accord as the controlling historical reference. Damien looked toward Elias, who quietly closed the notebook after the final document had been displayed. Neither celebration nor triumph appeared on his face. Instead, there was quiet relief, as though years of carrying someone else's buried truth had finally reached its proper destination. Outside the council building, thousands of citizens gathered beneath the afternoon sky, watching the official announcement broadcast across enormous public screens. For the first time in generations, the foundation of the Alpha and Omega legal system had begun changing, not because of fear, but because one silent Omega refused to let history remain hidden. 1 year later, the city of Blackridge looked different in ways that no one would have believed possible. The banners hanging above government buildings no longer displayed the old council crest alone. Alongside it flew the new emblem of the Harmony Charter, restored from Evelyn Whitmore's original design after independent historians confirmed her authorship beyond question. The emergency judicial review had become the largest legal reform in modern Alpha and Omega history. The revised laws recognized that every Omega possessed the same rights to education, property ownership, professional leadership, and personal choice as every other citizen. Fated bonds were no longer treated as political liabilities or legal instruments. Instead, they became private matters protected by law rather than controlled by government. The laboratories that had once hidden evidence were transformed into public archives and research centers dedicated to ethical scholarship. Margaret Holloway accepted an appointment to oversee the transition, ensuring that every restored document remained permanently accessible to future generations. Damien also changed. Although he remained the head of the Ashford Syndicate, his leadership no longer depended upon fear or unquestioned authority. Many of the organization's former operations evolved into legitimate security and logistics businesses working openly with neighboring communities. Some longtime rivals expected his influence to disappear after the reforms, yet respect proved far more durable than intimidation. People followed him because they trusted his judgment, not because they feared the consequences of refusing. Elias found a purpose that belonged entirely to himself. With support from educators, legal scholars, and community leaders across Alpha, Beta, and Omega backgrounds, he established the Evelyn Whitmore Institute for Civic Law. The school specialized in teaching constitutional history, public service, and equal legal access so that no future generation would grow up believing that silence and inequality were natural parts of society. Every classroom included adaptive communication resources because Elias wanted students of every ability to participate fully. Although he still communicated through writing and sign language, his voice reached farther than speeches ever could. On the first anniversary of the historic council hearing, thousands gathered outside the restored Civic Hall where the original Harmony Accord had once been hidden from public view. Families from every background filled the square, while children explored exhibits explaining how ordinary citizens had helped preserve the truth. Damien stood quietly near the entrance until Elias approached, carrying the familiar notebook that had remained beside him from the beginning. Its pages were now filled almost completely, recording not only painful memories, but also every important step that had brought them to this day. Elias opened to the final blank page and wrote one last sentence before handing the notebook to Damien. Destiny may open a door, but people choose whether to walk through it together. Damien read the words slowly before closing the notebook with careful hands. He looked toward Elias, no longer seeing a hostage, a political symbol, or even someone defined only by a rare bond. He saw an equal whose courage had transformed both his own life and an entire society. As the evening sun settled across the city skyline, The crowd applauded the unveiling of Evelyn Whitmore's restored memorial, honoring the woman whose ideas had finally reached the future she imagined. Damien and Elias stepped onto the balcony overlooking the celebration, standing side by side as the new Harmony Charter was raised above Blackridge for the first time. The invisible connection that had once threatened to divide families and strengthen corrupt leaders had become something entirely different. Months earlier, independent medical observers had quietly completed the final verification that Damien and Elias truly shared a natural fated bond. By then, however, the announcement no longer carried the political power it once would have. Under the restored Harmony Charter, destiny no longer determined authority. It simply acknowledged what both of them had already chosen freely. It had inspired two people to challenge injustice, restore forgotten history, and prove that the strongest future for the Alpha and Omega world would never be built through fear, but through trust freely chosen every single day. If you were in their place, what choice would you have made? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy Alpha and Omega stories filled with love, sacrifice, heartbreak, and unforgettable second chances, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey.